welcome back to the afternoon of the scientific track session. We've got a couple of really great talks coming up now, so I'm really excited to introduce Edwina Mead. She's a PhD student at UNSW and a RA at UTS, the other way around. And she's going to talk to us about conquering a complex systematic review with Python, which is something that's very near and dear to my heart, having failed to do so quite badly a few times. So, over to you, Edwina.
So hi, everyone. My name is Edwina Mead, and I'm a PhD student in public health, which basically means that I'm becoming an expert in reading 50,000 research papers and somehow remembering what they all said. But there is a twist. I used to be a software engineer. Not the most obvious career path, but my coding skills have been invaluable for all kinds of data wrangling, including the project I'll be talking about today. I'll be talking about the methods that I've been using to screen academic papers for the literature review I'm doing as part of my thesis. This is a wild journey through finding all the right keywords to start my search, resulting in an enormous haystack of way too many academic papers. Then I'll take you through my thought process of how I started using plain old Python regular expressions to try and narrow this down, to how I tried to refine that using natural language processing, and eventually jumping onto the large language model bandwagon. And of course, I'll go through all the numerous pitfalls and traps that I fell into along the way. But before I begin, I'd just like to note that I'm going to be talking about my research, which is about childbirth. And I acknowledge that this can be a difficult topic for many people, so please prioritize your well-being and feel free to step out at any time if you need to. All right. With that aside, I want to quickly take you through the motivation I have for this review, because I think it'll help you understand where I'm coming from. The topic of this review is the long-term health effects of caesarean section. And I picked this topic partly because of my own experiences with childbirth, having had my first baby by C-section and my second naturally. I wasn't particularly impressed with my C-section experience, which I think was completely unnecessary. And so I wanted to understand all the implications. Why did this happen to me? What does it mean for me and my son? What about my future babies? This question has led me through quite a road of first formal and then informal research, to now through my PhD. And it turns out that my experience of having an unnecessary C-section is actually quite common. Let's contextualize this a little bit further for Australia. Our C-section rate is quite high compared to other similar countries around the world. And also very, very high compared to the World Health Organization's recommended rate of 10 to 15%. In 2022, we had a 39% C-section rate, and that's been increasing at a rate of about 1% per year, which is much faster than expected compared to any demographic changes that might increase women's risk of having complications during pregnancy. And C-sections can be life-saving in certain situations, but most C-sections in Australia are done for much more ambiguous reasons, like having had a caesarean in a previous pregnancy, or slow low progress in labour, even when the mother and baby are healthy. And while some C-sections are undoubtedly necessary, all of them, even the ambiguous ones, carry all of the risks of major surgery for mothers. And even in planned caesareans, when the baby isn't in trouble, babies struggle more with the transition to extrauterine life. And one more thing to consider is that doing too many caesareans is really resource intensive. It results in monopolizing our operating theatres and clogging up the postnatal wards. But what about long-term risks? Previous systematic reviews on this have tended to focus on very specific issues, like subsequent pregnancy outcomes for women and obesity in their children as they grow up. I wanted to fill in this gap and build a comprehensive picture of the long-term risks and benefits of C-sections for women, babies, and society as a whole. And this type of review is called a scoping review, where you map out what kind of research activity is happening within your area of interest. For example, scoping reviews help us find out what subtopics are being researched, which topics are most popular, and which areas are not being researched, and so on. And so this is the normal process that's used to do a scoping review. It looks pretty simple. Do some database searches, find relevant papers, read them, extract some data, write it all up, and boom, you've got a publication. Yeah, if only it were that easy. It's a bit like drawing instructions. Draw 2 circles, then draw the rest of the owl. Easier said than done. In reality, it really depends on the size of your topic area. In some cases, you might be on a first-name basis with all 5 authors in your field. But I'm at the other end of the spectrum, and so I knew I was going to have to do a lot of reading. But I don't think that I or my supervisors were at all aware of the sheer size of my topic area. There are literally hundreds of thousands of papers. And nor do we have any clue about the challenges that would arise when trying to do the searches within it. So let's walk through the process. Here's a little preview of what a basic search for papers referring to C-sections might look like in one popular database called PubMed. It's got a little Boolean logic going on, but nothing horrible. You go stick it in this query box, hit search, and off you go. And so the first issue I came across was finding all the papers that talk about C-sections. Someone really needs to inform the research world that using consistent terminology would really help me personally do my PhD, because here are some of the different ways of referring to how the baby came out that I found in different research papers. The American spelling is by far the most common, but if you look carefully, you'll notice there are 4 different spellings of cesarean. Birth and delivery are used interchangeably, leading to some delightfully ambiguous terms like delivery method, which could refer to anything. Did they, like maybe pizzas? Did they ride a motorbike? Did they strap a parachute on the baby and drop it from a drone? Anyway, here's a chart of the top 10 terms plotted by the number of results from PubMed, representing 150,000 papers. And I'll remind you, this is just one database, and usually you want to use several. Which brings me to my next problem. How do I refine the search to be more specific? My first thought was to get rid of animal studies, because you would be very surprised at how many different animals are involved in C-section research. Here's a non-exhaustive selection of the most common. Yes, that is a stingray there at the bottom. I didn't even know stingrays gave live birth. Maybe I should pivot my research topic to underwater obstetrics. The papers would be definitely easier to find. Most of the other animals are obvious suspects because they're kept on farms or they're pets, and others like mice and monkeys are used as animal models in medical research. So that being said, I think doing a C-section on a mouse seems really fiddly, so props to the surgeons doing that. But you'd think that getting rid of these would be a simple matter of selecting humans in the subjects filter in a database, right? Not quite. There seem to be enough papers that are tagged incorrectly or are tagged as both animal and human, or just not tagged at all, that this doesn't work. So my second thought was I could exclude them by using keywords such as dog and cat, but that presents a similar problem as before. I'd have to think of all of the creative ways that scientists use to talk about animals, like canines and pups and dams, and worse. I found a lot of studies that look at why human children develop allergies, and a protective factor against that can be ownership of pets. So fortunately, I did find a solution, which was examining the journal title. This could be done using database syntax, but I actually ended up using Python. I'll come back to how I did that in a bit. And the next problem, and my main problem, was finding studies with the right outcome. I needed to separate the studies which have C-sections as the outcome, which is common for studies about pregnancy and labour management, from studies that look at C-section as the exposure, and looking at the short and long-term outcomes after the birth. Now, no matter what you do, and no matter which combination of keywords you use, you cannot do this using keywords only. I even consulted with university librarians, and they couldn't figure it out either. And they're the research wizards, the database wizards. And this is when I realized, when nobody had done this review before, it's just kind of too big and too hard, unless you know Python. I figured if I could get away from the limited search options in the research databases, then Python would be a much better delivery mode. So what if I could run a function over every record on PubMed with the full power of if statements, regular expressions, and anything else that I might want from PyPy? After all, it does fit in RAM. OK, well, the first thing to do then was download as much information about the potentially relevant articles as I could. Then all I'd need to do was make sure the formats were consistent, and then start searching. Great. Here's a little snapshot of the searches I built up for each database. Fortunately, 2 have a common syntax with others, so I only needed to do this 4 times. Then I put the searches into their respective search pages and hit the search buttons. Ah! That's not looking like a very reasonable number of records for a scoping review. Maybe if I restrict it to the last 10 years? OK. Well, nothing to do but move forward. Now, each database has a different delivery method. I mean, download file format. That should be OK. Python is my secret weapon. I wrote a series of little scripts to convert each output into CSV format. I use CSV because it's easy to inspect using Excel, or you can use the pandas library in Python. 2 databases returned XML files, which were a pain in the backside to extract just the bits that I cared about, but I figured it out. 3 databases were really easy because they already gave me CSV files, so all I had to do was rename the columns. And PubMed, bless its heart, has its own way of doing things. Fortunately, its output is quite easy to understand, so I just wrote a little script to parse it myself. But if you're wanting to do this, other people have also written libraries that are probably better than mine. So if you need to look at PubMed files, that's possibly a better option. So great. Now I have consistently formatted files on my own computer containing the title, abstract, and metadata for 75,000 articles. From there, it was a really easy job to exclude the duplicates. The PubMed ID and the Digital Object Identifier, or DOI, are unique IDs assigned to academic articles by different sources. So if the record had one of those, I could deduplicate by that. Some records didn't have one, so I just looked at the title, year, and first author's surname. And this was probably the easiest script in this whole process. And now I was getting to the good bit. I was finally able to use regular expressions on my data. I could apply them to journal names, article types, and even titles to get rid of irrelevant papers. I could also conveniently save records of anything that I'd excluded into a spreadsheet for later verification. OK, so on the right there is an example where I weeded out structural engineering papers by inspecting the journal names. Because it turns out that a C-section is a type of steel beam. Strong, yes. Relevant to my research, not so much. So, and similarly, going back to the animal studies, I could search for things like veterinary or ruminants in the journal name. Easy. There were also several journals that focus exclusively on case studies, which are also not useful for me, so out they went. All right, here's the results from my first pass. As you can see, most of the exclusions were duplicates. And I also inspected the article type field, which let me exclude conference presentations, book chapters, preprints, retracted articles, editorials, and other things that nobody needs to read. This got me down to 23,000 papers. Woohoo! Except, don't get too excited, because that's still basically the population of a small city. And I still hadn't found the right delivery method, research method, for the problem of separating C-section as outcome papers from C-section as exposure papers. Bother. So I set off on a quest to write a script that examined the titles and abstract for particular phrases. I ended up writing this thing that has over 100 regular expressions. It's not pretty, but it did get me down to 4,900 papers. But unfortunately, it was only a little more accurate than a stormtrooper's blaster. It had a hit rate of about 1 in 4. And at least 37 articles escaped. Bother. So clearly, I need a bigger blaster. So I attempted to improve this using natural language processing. I used the Natural Language Processing Toolkit Library, or NLTK, to improve the sentence splitting and phrase detection. OK, conda install NLTK, and I was on my way. This helped a bit because at least numbers with decimal points and bacteria names were handled correctly. And this took me down to 3,600 papers, but the accuracy rate wasn't really any better. And the force still wasn't strong enough to capture all of the true positives. So I looked around at different tools that might deliver some better results. And I found a few promising tools that could potentially solve my problem. But there was a catch. These droids come unassembled. I would have to build them myself, carefully creating curated training datasets. And I soon realized that this was a whole other beast and could probably be a PhD by itself. And I already have one of those on my plate, so that was out. So I thought a bit more, and I talked to some people about my problem and thought, you know what, these large language model things, I'm kind of a bit of a skeptic generally, but one thing they are really good at is extracting the meanings out of text. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. What if they could help me decide which articles to read? There are lots of fancy LLMs on the market these days. You've probably heard of some of them. But as a PhD, let's say my budget for cutting-edge AIs is a bit limited. Ideally, I would like to run perhaps one locally, but alas, my humble MacBook Air lacks the firepower. You can't fit the Death Star in a shoebox, so I had to stick to the cloud. And Gemini, with its generous free tier, huge sign-up credit, and decent license agreement, seemed like an ideal first candidate. It wasn't as accurate as some of the others, like Claude, but hey, beggars can't be choosers, right? I did consider playing the models off against each other, which is a technique that is known to deliver better results. But honestly, I've got a thesis to write, and so figuring out how to do that was not a luxury I could afford. All right, conda install Google Generative AI. Off we go. So at first, I tried writing a prompt to get Gemini to decide whether to keep or discard a paper given its abstract. And other researchers have had some success doing this, but this didn't work for me at all. Gemini, in its infinite wisdom, decided that 9 months was longer than 12 months. Clearly, it hasn't quite mastered the concept of time or basic maths. But fortunately, I found that if I just ask questions like, how long is the follow-up in the study, and what country was the study performed in, it gave pretty accurate answers. OK, that's no problem. If I tell Gemini to extract the information into JSON format, I can just put it with my rest of my data and filter it afterwards myself in Python. So using this method, I used the Gemini API to extract a number of different pieces of information from all 23,000 articles. This included what country the study was performed in, a one-sentence summary of who the participants were, lists of exposures and outcomes, and how long after the birth the last observation was taken. I placed all this information in the CSV file with the data that I had already downloaded from the research databases. And so, now Gemini had given me the semantic information about each of the abstracts, it became a relatively easy problem to use Python to run some regular expressions, again, to filter over my new columns. First, I tackled the geographical challenge, looking for studies done in high-income countries like Australia. I downloaded the list of their countries and their income levels from the World Bank, ready to cross-reference with Gemini's findings. But alas, my droid assistant seemed to have an unusual understanding of global geography. Texas, independent nation? Boston, vying for world domination? After some corrections and a virtual trip around the globe, I managed to use this to filter out almost 11,000 papers. Brilliant. I could also use regular expressions on the one-sentence description of the participants and get rid of obviously irrelevant cohorts like anaesthetists or healthcare workers. Similarly, I was also able to revisit my long list of synonyms for how the baby came out and exclude studies where C-sections were not in the exposure and and where C-section was not, exclude studies where C-sections were not in the exposure or where a C-section was one of the outcomes. And finally, I tackled the long-term problem, aiming to banish studies where the follow-up was 12 months or less. And Gemini tended to return the information in whatever format the authors had written it in. But I could use Python to handle this. I conda installed num2words and wrote some moderately complex regular expressions to match ranges of numbers of days, months, and years. These strategic maneuvers resulted in a set of 1,611 records. That's not so bad. It's still a lot for a scoping review, but it's manageable. And it spared my collaborators the arduous task of also reading a galaxy's worth of abstracts. And an additional benefit of Python was the ease of tuning. As you can see here, I also output the reason why each record was excluded. And I created a separate spreadsheet tracking the performance of each individual regular expression. This allowed me to go in, see why any individual article was excluded, and audit how effective each expression was. OK, reality check. Remember this flowchart from before? Everything I've just talked about has taken the place of exactly one step: the keyword search. Even with all my fancy Python scripts, this is the reality of research. Sometimes you just have to read a lot. So we did that. The three of us on my team read 1,600 abstracts. That's about 4 novels worth of abstracts. Not exactly a walk in the park, but at least it wasn't 23,000's worth of abstracts. And after countless hours of reading and debating, we found that about 1/3 of the included articles were true positives. A good start. And because I'm meticulous, or possibly just a masochist, I also decided to check for false negatives. This involved a lightly reading, that is, skimming at warp speed, a random 3,400 articles that my scripts had excluded. And thankfully, the false negative rate was 0.4%. Phew. Now, Python, my ever-faithful companion, continued to be useful throughout this research journey. I was also able to use it to assist with the full text review of the 539 papers that my team had agreed upon. Using the list of outcomes extracted by Gemini, I was able to use its power to divide the papers into smaller, more manageable groups. This is a Jedi mind trick of organization, because instead of facing off against a monstrous pile of articles all at once, we could deal with them in chunks of 40 or fewer. This also allowed me to quickly assess the number of categories, 92, and yet again, it was also a matter of decoding other researchers' creative flair when describing their findings. So here's a little glimpse of my code. Python, my reliable protocol droid, was up for the challenge. With my newly organized data, I constructed a comprehensive spreadsheet listing all the articles for each outcome. Here's an example of one part in progress. And then came the fun part, reading all the full text, armed with a sense of humor and a healthy dose of skepticism. And after what felt like a parsecs-long journey through the literature, I emerged victorious with a treasure trove of insights. I even managed to create some snazzy charts like this one. This one shows the number of papers that found that C-section had a negative, neutral, or positive effect on the outcomes. And finally, I could begin to answer my burning questions. And the results, well, they'll have to be a topic for a future talk. And as with any research project, there's always room for improvement. Here are a couple of things that I learned along the way that might be helpful for anyone who would be brave enough to tackle a massive literature review like this. First, I highly recommend checking out Simon Willison's LLM package. This would have been a way to quickly interface with several LLMs at once, and including running some locally if I wanted. And that would more easily allow me to combine the results, combine the outputs to improve my results. Simon's blog is also a great way to keep up with developments in this area. Secondly, and relatedly, there has been a new release of a model called NewExtract, one variant of which can be run locally. It's trained explicitly for the purpose of extracting structured information from text. The latest release came out in October, and apparently their flagship model beats OpenAI's GPT-4 Omni for single-shot text extraction problems. So that's definitely a promising model to try out. Okay, to sum up this epic saga, I now have a really good understanding of why this research hadn't been done yet. The problem was just so big. But being able to use Python made it possible. And Gemini, as a tool, while not perfect, it sped up my work and increased my accuracy and reduced the manual screening load. Because there's no way that my team would have read 23,000 abstracts. So my scripts were very specific for my problem, but they do offer a glimpse into the future of automated literature reviews. And as the rate of academic publishing increases, I suspect that approaches like this are going to become increasingly necessary. And so the next time you find yourself facing a daunting research challenge, just remember, with the right tools and a bit of perseverance, even the most formidable Death Star can be conquered. Thank you.
Thanks, Edwina. That was a brilliant talk. And to say thank you, we've got one of these very snazzy PyCon mugs.
Lovely, thank you.
I think we've got time for a few questions. Is there anyone who wants to ask a question? Yeah, one there, Kai.
Thanks, that was great. What are the chances of introducing a metadata standard?
Yes, well, so I'm doing a scoping review, which it's the older, even, how do I call this, structured abstracts seem to be a relatively recent development. And so backfitting metadata to older articles could be really difficult. And I don't know how likely the database providers would be willing to do that. I think that would be absolutely fantastic for what it's worth, but yeah, difficult.
Thank you. Have you thought about including citation rates?
Sorry,
citation rates.
Citation rates?
Because some of the papers you might get, some of them might be like some of them bad, some of them good, and the standard way, which I don't necessarily agree that's the best way, but it's citation rate, isn't it?
Yeah. So for a scoping review, we don't normally do that much sort of analysis of how the quality of the papers. If you were to do a systematic review and meta-analysis, you'd do that. But yeah, the purpose of the scoping review is just to look at what things are being researched. And yeah, there were a couple of articles where I just couldn't access the full text, so we had to get rid of them. And I suspect they're probably some of the low quality ones anyway. But yeah.
Any more questions? Can't see any. I think, yeah, thank you very much then.
Oh, very welcome.